Hi friends, there are a lot of amazing stories in our world about how ordinary people like you and me achieved incredible results of success thanks to their creative and sometimes even crazy ideas which they simply couldn't get out of their head. And in spite of the general opinion of those around them, they would pursue their goal, often hearing all kinds of nasty things about themselves from those who simply thought they were crazy. And today, friends, I'll tell you the story of a man who, in his time, was able to do what no one else could before him, and you'll see what came out of it. Gary Dahl was an ordinary working man who had been working his whole life. He was not what we would consider successful at that time. In his 40s, the only thing he could really brag about was his position as freelance editor and the loan for his house. Life was passing him by, and nothing indicated that things would be any different. The daily routine and low-paying work kept him waking up every day and running around doing errands. But everything changed when one day Gary went into a bar. That's right, a very ordinary trip to the bar with his colleagues would soon change his whole life. What's more, it's not only his life that would be changed, but also the lives of millions of people living across the United States. The idea that Gary got came to him while sitting in a bar one evening, listening to a lively conversation among his acquaintances about how hard it is to take care of pets. He wouldn't know, though, since he didn't have either a dog or a cat, and no one was waiting for him back home apart from his wife. And so, when it came to be his turn, the man said that he had his own opinion on the matter. See, my favorite animal is a rock. It doesn't require any care at all. Strange, no? As he blurted out the first thing that popped into his head to keep the conversation going, he had no idea that his very statement would soon change his whole life. To his surprise, his outburst was received so well that many who were with him at the table began to build upon the subject, saying that rocks don't need any care and can be left at home for prolonged periods of time. That evening, this noisy group of friends joked on and on about this, but none of his fellow office workers could have even imagined what was going on in Gary Dahl's head at the moment. On the way home, Gary realized that his invention could bring him great income. Over the next few days, the idea matured in his head. It went as far as to consume him entirely. And given the fact that Gary was a freelance editor, he had thought it all through. The idea came to him at the table to bring to life exactly what the group had been talking about. From here on out, Gary got to work. Of course, as with any other business, the first thing that was needed was an investment. An investment in advertising was vital, and without it, there would be nothing. Since Gary simply had no money, the only option was to seek out a couple of investors. But I think you have already understood any investor who could potentially help him financially just twiddled their thumbs and laughed at him. This probably isn't strange at all. Imagine yourself in this situation, potentially investing a tidy sum of money into the sale of rocks. Each time potential investors wished him good luck and left the meeting before they had heard the idea to the end. In their opinion, the idea was simply absurd. It would be easier to invest in real estate or a profitable business project and not in this madman's idea. This is what one of those people who Gary had asked the money from later said. There were many of these meetings, and each of them was unsuccessful. As the man himself later said, his friends even stopped picking up the phone when he called them, and they always avoided him. People thought Gary was the city madman, and it became more and more difficult to find investors. But Dahl was so confident in what he was doing that he was unaffected by mockery and sarcasm from the outside. His wife also played a large role in his life. She wasn't necessarily convinced by his idea, but she didn't bother him, and even gave him that little push he needed when he was ready to give up. Anyway, after a few months, he still managed to find 2 investors who believed in him. The sums were not big, but they were enough to move to the next stage, which was to buy a bunch of rocks from a Mexican beach for $1 a piece at the nearest construction store. Next, all that was left to do was to think of the concept. Gary took a rock and imagined that it was his pet. He carried it around the house and took care of it for a few days. Many people would think that he was crazy, but just like that, a special box for carrying rocks with holes in it was designed so that the so-called pet would not suffocate and would be able to breathe. The man also came up with a soft bedding made of pine shavings, but that was not all. Gary's concept also included guidelines for caring for the new pet. And in the instructions he wrote, if, when you remove the rock from its box, it appears to be excited, place it on some old newspapers. The rock will know what the paper is for and will require no further instruction. It will remain on the paper until you remove it. And when Gary had everything ready, that's when he decided to please the people of America with his expertise. His first ad for the sale of the pets appeared in a small local newspaper. He expected to have to invest a lot into advertising and getting the word out everywhere to make his product known, but even then he couldn't have imagined what would happen next. As it turned out, the rocks hit the market at just the right time. The Vietnam War had just recently ended. There was so much bad news circulating that his pet rock fad was immediately picked up by all the local and national media networks. People were all for this new form of amusement in the form of a pet rock. Instead of investing further money in advertising, Gary ended up having to buy more and more pet rocks. The initial idea had now blown up. For the first time, the rocks appeared on Christmas Day in 1975, and within the first few months, they sold an unreal 1.5 million pieces. Gary thought the concept through perfectly. The price per pet rock was insignificant, only $3.95, and even for an ordinary person, there was no problem getting such an unusual pet. The fact that Gary only spent 1 cent on each rock was also to be considered. Gary's profit from each rock was $3.94, and for 6 months in 1975, he earned more than $18 million. Adjusted for today's money, that would have been equal to approximately $65 million. Gary Dahl himself recalled that there was no shortage of customers, and he even had to hire a guy to answer the phone on his behalf. At first, he ordered boxes from a local factory and packed the pets in his garage. But after a few months, he had over 100 people working for him, and it was a full-fledged factory. The calls came in so much that all the post offices that were in the area practically worked for Gary. And it was not uncommon to see the local post office's truck fully loaded with pet rocks. A year later, the rich man moved into a luxurious house with a swimming pool and exchanged the old Honda for a new executive Mercedes. Part of Dahl's marketing strategy was to claim that the rocks could bring more pleasure than we could ever imagine. He convinced buyers that these rocks would support the claim by their mere existence and clearly demonstrate that it is not the object itself that brings joy to the child within us, but the idea of it. The pet occupies a niche in our minds created by the power of imagination. Exercising the mind is the very pleasure. Those who bought the unusual pets often gave them names, talked to them, caressed them, and tried to teach them simple tricks. But in general, it was just fashionable. Every schoolboy and adult at home or in the office just had to have such a pet. As Gary later recalled, it was a crazy time. Honestly, I couldn't believe what was happening to me. Not long ago, I was working my butt off for pennies, and now I could afford anything. Soon I stopped counting the money. Of course, this triumph only lasted a few years. In America, there were a lot of craftsmen offering all kinds of rocks, 200-year-old rarities, rocks painted in the colors of the American flag, and even rocks with scientific degrees, where a bachelor's degree was $3, but a doctorate cost as much as $10. The market was overcrowded, roughly in the same way that fidget spinners today and other knickknacks that seemingly came out of nowhere appeared on store shelves and then disappeared. But many people hadn't thought about how, in so little time, one could make a really huge fortune, one that an ordinary person would never earn in even a few lifetimes. Gary and his wife used the money they earned to build and purchase real estate, which according to the minimum estimates is not much, but several blocks in their hometown. And in 2001, the book Advertising for Dummies was published, where Gary personally gave beginner marketers a lot of effective advice. On March 23, 2015, at the age of 78, Gary passed away. But for many people, this man has remained a memory forever as an example that nothing is impossible. Even in old age, he always said that if you believe in your dreams and go the whole 9 yards, sooner or later you will succeed. There aren't really any more details of his life, unfortunately, that we can find, only that he spent the rest of his life living on the money that he earned in that short period of time, all thanks to his crazy idea, which many considered idiotic. Unlike most fads, pet rocks continue to live on the internet even today. There are sites where you can still purchase a pet rock, although new manufacturers have given them a new look. They are painted, coated with designs, and decorated in various ways. And all this differs heavily from that very first moment when a stupid idea came into the mind of a very ordinary person. As you can see, everything that is brilliant is simple. Friends, what do you think of Gary's idea? Would you be able to come up with something like this? Be sure to write your opinion in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel. See you soon. Bye.